The porcelain shattered against the marble floor, and every servant in the room flinched except one. Amara Bennett didn't even blink. She simply looked at the tea tray in ruins at her feet, then lifted her eyes to the man who had just knocked it out of her hands. "You're 5 minutes late," Takumi Kurosawa said, voice like ice. "You're fired." The other maids had already learned to run at that sentence. Some cried, some begged. One had fainted on the spot weeks earlier. Takumi expected the same reaction now, the trembling apology, the desperate plea to keep her job. Instead, Amara reached behind her back, untied her apron, and folded it neatly over her arm. "All right," she said calmly. "Where should I leave the keys?" For the first time in longer than he could remember, Takumi Kurosawa had absolutely nothing to say. If you love slow burn stories where the coldest man alive meets the one woman who refuses to bow to him, you're going to want to stay for this one. Make sure you're subscribed, because this story is about to get a lot more intense. The Kurosawa mansion had a reputation that stretched across Tokyo, whispered about in kitchens and staffing agencies alike. No maid lasted more than a few weeks under its roof. Some couldn't handle the impossible standards. Others crumbled under the icy silence that filled every hallway. And a few simply became too afraid of the man who ruled the house like a general commanding a war. He was always fighting alone. Takumi Kurosawa was 32 years old, and he was the heir to one of the most powerful Yakuza organizations in the country. He wore his tailored suits like armor, spoke in clipped, precise sentences, and moved through his own home like a stranger who merely tolerated its existence. His father, Ryuji Kurosawa, had built an empire through decades of ruthless discipline, and everyone assumed Takumi had simply inherited his father's coldness, along with his fortune. Few people knew the truth, that somewhere beneath the tailored suits and the icy detachment was a boy who had never stopped blaming himself for his mother's death. Amara Bennett knew none of this when she stepped off the plane in Tokyo 3 weeks earlier. She was 26, sharp-witted, and utterly unimpressed by titles or money. She had left London after a housekeeping agency offered her an unusually generous live-in position at a private estate. She needed the fresh start, the steady income, and frankly, the distance from a life that had grown too small for her ambitions. She had heard rumors about her new employer during the agency's brief orientation. A demanding young master, impossible to please, prone to firing staff on a whim. She had nodded politely and filed the warning away without much concern. She had dealt with difficult people before. She wasn't about to let one more intimidate her. Her first morning at the estate had gone according to plan, until the kitchen staff miscommunicated the breakfast schedule, and Amara found herself walking into the dining room 5 minutes behind Takumi's rigid timetable. She hadn't expected him to be so young. She certainly hadn't expected the way his sharp, assessing gaze made the room feel smaller. And she definitely hadn't expected him to knock the tray from her hands before she'd even set it down. "You're fired," he'd said, like it was the simplest sentence in the world. And when she calmly took off her apron instead of falling apart, something in his carefully controlled world tilted just slightly off its axis. "Wait," he said, before she could turn away. Amara raised an eyebrow. "I thought I was fired." Takumi's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, and he certainly wasn't used to the flicker of amusement dancing behind her calm expression. "You're on probation," he said finally, the words clearly unfamiliar in his mouth. "Generous of you," Amara replied, tying her apron back on without so much as a thank you. She walked past him toward the kitchen, leaving Takumi standing alone in the dining room, staring at the space where a broken teacup lay scattered across the marble, and wondering for the first time in years why he hadn't simply let her walk out the door. Over the following weeks, Amara quickly learned that surviving in the Kurosawa household required more than just competence. It required patience, thick skin, and an unshakable sense of self that refused to bend under Takumi's relentless scrutiny. He tested her constantly. He changed instructions without warning, criticized details no one else would even notice, and set standards so precise they seemed designed purely to make her fail. But Amara never gave him the satisfaction of watching her break. When he complained the flowers in the hallway were arranged incorrectly, she rearranged them without a word, then met his gaze with a small, defiant smile that made his chest tighten in a way he refused to acknowledge. When he snapped at her for a minor delay in his schedule, she simply replied, "Would you like me to set a timer, or would you prefer to keep yelling? Either way, I'll get it done." No one spoke to Takumi Kurosawa that way. No one dared. Slowly, without either of them fully realizing it, their sharp exchanges began to shift into something else entirely. Somewhere between the tension and the testing, Amara became the only person in that enormous, silent mansion who spoke to him with total honesty. Not fear, not flattery, just truth. And Takumi, despite every instinct telling him to push her away like he had pushed everyone else away, found himself oddly drawn to the one person who refused to be intimidated by him. One evening, working late in his study, he found her standing in the doorway with a cup of tea she hadn't been asked to bring. "You skipped dinner?" she said simply, setting the cup on his desk. "I didn't ask for that," Takumi said, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "I know," Amara replied. "I brought it anyway." She turned to leave, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, Takumi found himself speaking before she reached the door. "Why do you stay?" he asked quietly. "Everyone else leaves within weeks." Amara paused, glancing back at him with an expression that wasn't pity, but something gentler. "Because underneath all that ice," she said, "I don't think you're actually trying to scare people away. I think you're trying to see who's strong enough to stay." Takumi said nothing. But long after she left the room, her words lingered in the silence, refusing to fade. This is where things start to shift between them. But trust me, it's about to get so much harder before it gets easier. If you're already invested in these two, drop a comment telling me who you're rooting for. And don't forget to like this video. As the weeks passed, small cracks began to appear in the wall Takumi had spent years building around himself. He started finding reasons to be in the same room as her. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. The way she hummed softly while working, the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. One rainy evening, Ryuji Kurosawa, Takumi's father, observed the shift in his son's behavior, with the sharp, calculating perception that had made him the head of one of Tokyo's most powerful organizations. He found Takumi standing at the window, watching the garden where Amara had been caught in the sudden downpour, laughing as she rushed to gather fallen laundry from the line. "You watch her a great deal," Ryuji said, startling his son from his thoughts. "She's an employee," Takumi replied stiffly. "I'm simply making sure she does her job." Ryuji allowed a rare, knowing smile. "Your mother used to laugh like that," he said quietly. "In the rain. She never cared about ruining her clothes. Takumi's expression tightened, old grief flickering behind his eyes. I don't want to talk about her, he said. I know, Ryuji replied gently. You never do. But perhaps it's time you let someone in, before the silence swallows you the way it swallowed me for years after she was gone. Takumi said nothing, but his father's words settled into the same place where Amara's had taken root. Quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. The truth about Takumi's mother had haunted him since childhood, a wound he had never allowed to heal. She had died in an accident when he was just a teenager, one that Takumi had convinced himself, over years of guilt and silence, was somehow his fault. Amara didn't learn the full truth until one late night, when she found him sitting alone in the mansion's private garden, staring at an old photograph he thought no one knew he kept. She didn't ask. She simply sat beside him in silence, giving him space rather than pressure. Eventually Takumi spoke, his voice raw in a way she'd never heard from him before. She died because of me, he admitted quietly. I asked her to stay a little longer that night. If I hadn't... You were a child, Amara interrupted gently. Children don't carry that kind of responsibility, Takumi. You didn't cause an accident. You lost your mother. Those are two very different things. Takumi turned to look at her, eyes glistening with emotions he'd spent over a decade refusing to show anyone. No one has ever said that to me, he whispered. Then it's time someone did, Amara replied. In that quiet garden, beneath a sky full of stars neither of them noticed, the wall Takumi had spent years constructing began finally to crumble. Their relationship deepened after that night. Takumi found himself, for the first time in his adult life, wanting to be a better man, not for his father's approval, not for his organization's reputation, but simply because of the way Amara looked at him like he was worth the effort. But peace was never something the Kurosawa world allowed to last. Reina Akiyama had been Takumi's arranged fiancée years earlier. A match dissolved after both families quietly agreed it no longer served their interests. Beautiful, sophisticated, and deeply connected to another powerful family, Reina had never fully accepted the end of that arrangement, and she certainly wasn't prepared to watch Takumi fall for a foreign housekeeper instead. She arrived at the estate unannounced one afternoon, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto Amara as though sizing up a threat. So you're the maid everyone's been talking about, Reina said. Her tone dipped in condescension. I have to admit, I expected someone more impressive. Amara met her gaze evenly, refusing to be rattled. And I expected someone with better manners, she replied smoothly. But I suppose we're both disappointed today. Reina's expression flickered with irritation before smoothing back into practiced composure. You should be careful, she said quietly, leaning closer so only Amara could hear. Men like Takumi don't fall in love with women like you. They fall into temporary distractions, and distractions always get discarded eventually. The words cut deeper than Amara wanted to admit, but she refused to let it show. Then I suppose, she said calmly, Takumi will have to decide what I am to him, not you. Reina's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Takumi appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in the tension between the two women. Reina, he said coldly, you weren't invited. I came to remind you of your responsibilities, Reina replied, straightening. Your father built an empire on strategic alliances, Takumi, not whims. Amara is not a whim, Takumi said, his voice sharp enough to end the conversation entirely. Reina's eyes flashed with something dangerous before she offered a tight, humorless smile. We'll see how long that lasts, she said, before turning and walking away. But her threat wasn't an empty one. Within days, Whispers began circulating through the Kurosawa organization, rumors that Amara's presence in the household was no accident. According to the rumors, Amara's father had once worked for a rival operation years earlier, an operation that had clashed violently with the Kurosawa family long before Takumi was even born. The implication was clear and devastating. Amara hadn't come to Tokyo by chance. She had come for revenge. Takumi confronted her the night the accusations reached him, his expression a storm of confusion, betrayal, and barely restrained anger. "Is it true?" he demanded, voice tight with emotion he could no longer suppress. "Did your father work against my family?" Amara's heart shattered at the accusation, but she refused to look away from him. "My father worked for your family, Takumi," she said, voice trembling but firm. "Years ago, as a translator for business dealings overseas. He left that job long before I was even born, and he passed away when I was a teenager. I didn't even know the connection existed until this very moment." "Then why didn't you tell me?" Takumi asked, the hurt in his voice unmistakable. "Because I didn't know it mattered," Amara replied, tears finally slipping free. "Because I never once thought my father's old job would somehow make me a suspect in your eyes." Takumi wanted desperately to believe her, but years of distrust, betrayal, and a lifetime spent protecting himself from vulnerability made it impossible for him to simply let go of the doubt clawing at his mind. "I need time," he said quietly, turning away from her. "Takumi." "Please," he said, voice breaking slightly. "Just give me time." Amara stood frozen in the hallway long after he disappeared, her heart shattering into pieces she wasn't sure could ever be put back together. This is the moment everything falls apart. If you're feeling that ache right now, let me know in the comments. And if this story has you completely hooked, please subscribe, so you don't miss how it all comes together. The days that followed were unbearable. Amara continued her duties around the mansion, but the warmth that had grown between her and Takumi had been replaced by a suffocating silence, far colder than anything from their earliest days together. Takumi buried himself in work, avoiding her at every turn, wrestling internally with a battle between the trust he'd slowly built with her and the paranoia bred into him by a lifetime surrounded by betrayal. It was Ryuji who finally intervened, finding his son alone in his office late one night, staring blankly at paperwork he clearly wasn't reading. "You're making a mistake," Ryuji said simply. Takumi looked up, exhausted. "You don't know that." "I know pain when I see it," Ryuji replied. "And I know when a man is about to lose something precious out of fear rather than fact." He set a folder on his son's desk, documents Ryuji himself had quietly requested to verify Amara's father's history with the organization. "Her father was a translator," Ryuji said. "Nothing more. He left the organization on good terms, long before any conflict with rival families began. There is no connection to revenge here, Takumi. Only your own fear, dressed up as suspicion." Takumi stared at the documents, guilt crashing over him as the truth became undeniable. "I accused her," he whispered. "I let my fear push away the one person who's ever seen me clearly." "Then stop talking to me," Ryuji said, allowing the faintest hint of a smile, "and go fix it." But by the time Takumi rushed to find her, Amara was already gone. She had packed her things quietly that same evening, unable to bear another day in a house where the man she loved doubted her so completely. She left without a word, moving into a small apartment across the city, determined to rebuild the life she had once again been forced to start from scratch. For days, Takumi searched for her, his composure crumbling with every failed attempt to locate her. His father's connections eventually led him to her new address, but knowing where she was and knowing what to say were two entirely different battles. He stood outside her apartment building for nearly an hour when Amara opened the door and saw him standing there, drenched from the rain, stripped of every ounce of his usual composure, She felt her heart twist painfully in her chest. Takumi. I was wrong, he said before she could finish, his voice raw and trembling in a way she had never heard before. I let fear control me, instead of trusting the one person who has never given me a single reason to doubt her. You hurt me, Amara said quietly, tears welling in her eyes despite her efforts to stay composed. You looked at me like I was capable of using you. I know, Takumi said, stepping closer, desperation bleeding into every word. And I will spend every day proving to you how wrong I was, if you'll let me. Amara crossed her arms, trying to hold onto the wall she'd built to protect herself, but it was already crumbling under the weight of everything she felt for him. Why should I trust you again? She asked softly. Takumi closed the remaining distance between them, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. Because for the first time in my life, he said, voice breaking completely, I'm not afraid to say this out loud. I love you, Amara, and I am asking you, please, don't leave me. Amara stared at him for a long, breathless moment, searching his eyes for any trace of the coldness that once defined him. She found none, only a man, finally and completely undone, standing before her with nothing left to hide. You hurt me, she whispered again, voice trembling. I know, Takumi said, and I will never stop making it right if you give me the chance. Slowly, hesitantly, Amara reached out and took his hand. Don't make me regret this, she said softly. I won't, Takumi promised, pulling her into an embrace that finally, after everything, felt like coming home. Months later, the Kurosawa mansion looked and felt entirely different than it had the day Amara first arrived. The oppressive silence that once filled every hallway had been replaced by quiet warmth. Staff no longer whispered nervously about the master's temper. Reina had long since disappeared from their lives, her schemes exposed and dismissed by both families. And Ryuji watched his son transform before his very eyes, not into a softer version of himself, but into a stronger one, unafraid to feel, unafraid to love. Amara never became just another maid who blended into the background of that grand estate. She became the one person who saw past the wealth, the power, and the fear, straight into the heart of a man everyone else had given up trying to understand. And Takumi, the heir who had once fired every maid who dared enter his home, finally found the one person he never wanted to let go. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me while writing it, please take a moment to like this video. Drop a comment telling me your favorite part, and subscribe for more slow burn stories just like this one.